Arguably the most anticipated season of Ole Miss football awaits as the Rebels have stockpiled talent both in the recruiting ranks, the transfer portal, and beyond. And helping us break it all down, the 2024 Ole Miss Rebels, our good friend Brad Logan of Inside the Rebels, the 24/7 affiliate for Ole Miss, but not just that. He's doing a bunch of other stuff as well. The Believe in Ole Miss podcast. He's a host for them. He's a co-host on Red and Blue Crew podcast. He's all over the place, but one of the best in the business when it comes to covering all things Ole Miss. Brad, appreciate you taking the time, my friend. It's a pleasure having you on.
Absolutely, Chris. I think you hit the nail on the head. I don't know that maybe it's just in Oxford, but all across the SEC, as you've seen with your channel, a ton of excitement for this 24 season.
So, Brad, let's first look back at 2023 to sort of set the scene of how we got to where we currently are. Ole Miss breaks through, goes 11-2, 6-2 in conference play. You win that Peach Bowl over Penn State. And that really, again, I think set the scene for what we saw Ole Miss do in the transfer portal and the hype and building up to this year. And it kind of feels like Ole Miss has been building for a year like this. But Brad, when you look back on the 2023 season, when Ole Miss fans look back on that year, how will they look back on 2023?
I think a couple of games, oddly enough, Chris, it was the two losses. The first loss to Alabama when Ole Miss just simply didn't play well against a team that had better talent. And then, oddly enough, the 52-17 loss against Georgia when Ole Miss lost in Athens whenever it was a primetime game and there was a lot of excitement. Rebels went in with one loss. So I think mainly, Chris, at the end of that game, we were able to speak with Lane Kiffin in the locker room. He was obviously very dejected. But it was interesting that he said, we were outcoached today, but we were basically didn't have the athletes to win the game. And he would go on to say that we are not a college football playoff team. I remember that. And when we had media day for Ole Miss a couple of weeks ago, I had a chance to ask him. I said, Lane, at the end of the game, you looked at the media and said that you didn't have the players, you didn't have the coaches, you just didn't have what you needed to compete against Georgia on a big stage. During the offseason, were you able to address those questions and be able to get some answers? And he shook his head and said, yes, without hesitation. And Chris, as we look at the roster, we'll see that Ole Miss, along with the Grove Collective, its NIL arm, under the direction of Walker Jones, who was a former linebacker at Ole Miss under Tommy Tuberville in the late 1990s, who also was there in Georgia, also was there that saw that Ole Miss just could not compete with which I think would be the national champions had they not lost in the SEC championship game, but that's another story for another day. But I do think Ole Miss learned a lot from that game. Now, obviously, they would go on and not lose another game and have some success down the stretch. But I think going back to that Georgia game and understanding you are not one of the stalwarts in college football. They address those deficiencies in the offseason, and now you have before you one of the most talented rosters in Ole Miss history. Lane Kiffin even has admitted it's the best roster he's had while he's been at Ole Miss. And obviously, we'll see what happens on the field. You have to play the games, but I think Ole Miss has the best roster going into a season in the history of its program.
Brad, you mentioned Lane Kiffin entering his 5th season in Oxford. I'd imagine the approval rating for Lane is pretty high at this point. Again, Lane's not everybody's glass of tea, right? He's not it for everybody, but it feels like he's been a perfect fit for Ole Miss. Obviously, a shot in the arm for the program. What's the vibe right now around Rebel fans when it comes to Lane Kiffin?
Well, I just received word. It was the last night or the night before, as we record on Wednesday. Is the Kentucky game is a hard sellout, which means every game in the SEC in Oxford are hard sellouts. There are some tickets, with the exception of Mississippi State, which was moved from Thursday until Friday afternoon. So all the SEC games are sold out with the exception of Mississippi State, and then there are a few tickets remaining for the non-conference games. The exposure has been incredible for Ole Miss this year during the offseason. A lot of rankings, a lot of preseason magazines that are talking about first, second team, and all of that stuff that comes with the territory. But you've got an incredible amount of enthusiasm for the program. And you just look at ticket sales, you look at the money, and Denson Hollis with the Ole Miss Athletic Foundation posted on X/Twitter just yesterday that there were more people joining the Vault Collective and the Vault Society, I should say. And that is a marketing arm of not necessarily the NIL, but a marketing arm of Ole Miss Athletics, which that goes into capital campaigns for facilities. So not only is Ole Miss generating a ton of income for its NIL, it's also still considering donating towards a capital campaign and that sort of thing. So there's some things going on facility-wise that had kind of been put on the shelf because so much money had been allocated from fans to NIL. So it's a nice balancing act that Ole Miss has done. At the end of the day, parking is sold out. West Jackson is kind of funny on game days. They call it a parking lot. Well, it'll be an absolute parking lot this season. Traffic will not be able to move very good. If you're coming to Oxford to a game, they're encouraging everyone to get to Oxford as early as possible, specifically for those 11 o'clock games when everybody's going to be trying to get to Vaught-Hemingway Stadium at one time. Tickets are at an all-time high. Donations are up. And it all because of Lane Kiffin. And, Chris, you look at Ole Miss as a university, and the numbers haven't been released from the university yet, but I've been told that Ole Miss will have the largest freshman class, not only in the history of Ole Miss in the university, but in the history of any college or any university in the state of Mississippi. Is Lane Kiffin because of that? I think he's a part of it, sure. I think winning in football is big. Winning in the national championship in baseball in 22's played a factor. But I do think Lane Kiffin and winning in football is definitely a part of this university here at Ole Miss are continuing to grow from a numbers standpoint.
So, Brad, let's dive into this 2024 Ole Miss Rebels football team. We'll start on the offensive side specifically. It's been labeled as the last dance for Jaxson Dart, and I think he's labeled it that as well. He returns as QB1 after having a stellar 2023, and boy, oh boy, Brad, he's got some weapons. Trey Harris, Jordan Watkins, they're both back at wide receiver. You added South Carolina transfer Juice Wells from the portal, which if he's healthy, Brad, he was considered this time last year maybe the best wide receiver in the SEC. So you add that guy too. Caden Prescorn is back at the tight end spot. And oh, by the way, that trio that I mentioned, Trey Harris, Jordan Watkins, and Caden Prescorn combined for 2,175 receiving yards and 15 touchdowns in 2023. That's what you got coming back this year. Quinshon Judkins did depart and go to Ohio State. I know some folks there, Brad and Oxford, would say that's addition by subtraction because of some of the behind-the-scenes stuff. But Ulysses Bentley taking over at RB1. I'll let you expand as well on some of the transfers they picked up there. It's a loaded running back room. And then 3 of 5 starters back on the offensive line. And you did add Washington transfer Nate Calejo, I think is how you say his name. Either way, you added him. Yeah, you added him to that group, bolstered a really already strong group. So offensively, Brad, what you're expecting from the Rebels this season? I mean, it looks like it could be one of the most electric offenses in college football.
And what we've seen from our good folks at 24/7 that have covered practices so far, oddly enough, the starters that have returned for Ole Miss on the offensive line actually running second team. That's Jeremy James, Jaden Williams, and then Reese McIntyre. The 2 starters that transferred over from Washington, Julius Buello and Nate Calepo, both senior transfers, they were on a team, as you know, and a lot of the listeners and watchers know, that Washington was the national championship runner-up last year. They won the award for, I think it's the Jim Moore Award for the best offensive line in the country. So those are 2 huge pieces. Diego Pounds, also a sophomore transfer out of North Carolina, is running first team, along with Micah Pettis and Caleb Warren, the redshirt senior. We've seen Gertrude Scott, which transferred in from Southern Miss, who is a Swiss Army knife on the offensive line, can play a lot of different positions. We've seen him play center some and also at guard, and is going to rave reviews from John Garrison, the offensive line coach. You also look at players like Eli Acker that's got some experience, Preston Cushman, and then Cam East. You start talking 11, 12 deep, Chris, on the offensive line. That's big-time news for Ole Miss. That's a position that usually rears its head with injuries at some point during the season. So being able to have that instant depth on the offensive line is huge. You mentioned the wide receivers. One name that you didn't mention, a lot of people aren't familiar, is Deion Smith. Deion Smith, the former 5-star receiver that went to LSU out of high school, out of Jackson Prep, out of Central Mississippi. He would then leave LSU, transfer to Holmes Community College, lit up the NJCAA last year, ton of awards. And so he did commit to Ole Miss. There's been some issues with him with grades. We were told that he made the necessary grades. We were even told, sources close to him, that he was going to be able to practice this week. So we're waiting to see the availability on him. Basically, the description on him that I was given is he is a burner. He is one that goes vertical. and Jaxson Dart, the quarterback for Ole Miss, would be able to just basically toss it up. You already mentioned Jordan Watkins. He's an incredible receiver. He played with a broken hand last year against Auburn. Ole Miss really struggled catching punch with Dayton Wade, the senior that has graduated. Well, they put Jordan Watkins in with a broken hand, and he was able to clean up that punt return group. Now, the name Micah Davis, a senior transfer out of Utah, I think it's Utah State, has been brought in basically as a return specialist. So he's obviously going to lend a little bit of depth to that wide receiver room. You've already named off a lot of those receivers. One name I would add is Aiden Williams. He was a talented freshman last year, didn't get a ton of reps, kind of swam a little bit early last year, so really needed to learn the system. So we expect big things from him. Caden Lee is also a possession receiver, very crisp route runner. So it'll be interesting to see what Caden Lee does. He had a big bowl game against Penn State in the Peach Bowl. Now, let's go to tight ends just for a moment. You talked about Caden Prescorn. I want to throw another name at you. Daquan Wright. He's a big-time transfer out of Virginia Tech. Had a big year last year, and Daquan Wright would be a junior as he had a huge sophomore campaign at Virginia Tech. You hear the word transfer a lot, Chris, and oddly enough, for Ole Miss's defense, and we'll talk about them in a moment, all 11 starters are transfers. Only 2 out of the players running second team came to Ole Miss. Now, I will combat that. Brian Scott Rippey, who appeared on my podcast just earlier this week, made a great point. Sure, J.J. Pegues did transfer from Auburn. Jared Ivey did transfer from Georgia Tech. Pegues, of course, is defensive lineman, defensive tackle. J.J. Pegues, and then, of course, Jared Ivey, defensive end. But they've been in the program for a couple of years. They're leaders on this team. So I think we sometimes overshadow the fact that, sure, they're transfers, but they're not transfers that come into your fall camp. Some of these transfers have been on the roster for the last couple of years. So I think that does play in. But, yeah, offensively, wide receivers, we talked about them, Jaxson Dart. Knock on wood, the Rebels need him to stay healthy. You've got Walker Howard, a former 5-star, transferred from LSU, and you got a true freshman or true sophomore in this case. Austin Simmons is an absolute, he reminds me a lot of Michael Vick, the way he moves out of the pocket, gets the ball downfield, had a really good spring game, along with A.J. Maddox, a true freshman who had a really good spring game. At running back, it's going to be the Ulysses Bentley show. We visited with Ulysses Bentley. He was a transfer out of SMU, had a really good year last year, stayed a little injured. So, he told us during media day he's gained about 20 pounds of muscle. He's ready to be the number 1 back. And obviously Henry Parrish Jr. is going to be the number 2 punch for this Ole Miss team. He's very familiar for the Ole Miss fans, as of course he started his career out at Ole Miss, transferred to Miami, and now he's back. The name I'm interested to see is Rashad Amos. He's a senior transfer, and he's more of a bruiser. And if you'll remember a couple of years ago, Chris, Ole Miss had Jerrion Ely, Snoop Connor was the bruiser, and then I had one more running back, and those were a 1-2-3 punch. And we asked Lane Kiffin during the press conference the other day, is this what he expects to get out of this running back trio? And he smiled and said, no disrespect, but I don't care. I want to win. So that tells me that Ole Miss will have a 1-2-3 punch. And then remember, J.J. Pegues is someone that can run the ball if needed, that defensive tackle. We've seen him in the backfield as well. So, yeah, this offense is potent. It's the best offense in the history of Ole Miss football. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that. On paper, it's easily the most talented roster. Here's one thing I will say, Chris, and I differ from some of the folks that cover the team and some of the fans. I'm going to wait and see before I throw the flag out that Ole Miss will not miss Quinshon Judkins. I've seen how powerful of a running back he is. Ohio State is getting a good one. But I will say, on the latter part of the year, Ulysses Bentley really turned it on. So I know a lot of people are excited to see what he can do as running back number 1.
Brad, you mentioned the word transfer so many times. I'll tell you this, it's hard to keep up with them all, admittedly, but I did not know all 11 starters on Ole Miss's defense, which is where we're going to go next, looking at the defensive side of the ball. They all either transferred in this year or they've transferred at some point. They're all transfers. But either way, it's a really talented group. And you mentioned, Brad, that point after the Georgia game, which we may look back, if Ole Miss makes a run, wins the national title, I think it'll be that moment we looked at and said, that was the moment it clicked, that things changed. But you look at the defensive side, some of the biggest additions, Brad, come there. Obviously, there's some familiar faces. Jared Ivey, J.J. Pegues, you mentioned, Xavier Harris. They're all back up front. The big ones you picked up, A&M transfer Walter Nolan, Florida transfer Princely Oman Mielen. You bolster the front seven with those guys. Suntarine Perkins, Kari Coleman are back at linebacker. I thought one of the biggest additions you had, Arkansas transfer Pupal Jr. That's a massive, massive gain in the middle of that defense. John Saunders Jr., Trey Washington back in the secondary. You also added Bama transfer Trey Amos and Tennessee transfer Brandon Turnage to that secondary. And Pete Golding is the man orchestrating this, sort of pulling the strings, if you will. We saw flashes last year. Brad, what are you expecting from this defense? It feels like this is a group with the additions, with the big bodies up front. They should be ready to take the next step and compete against the very best.
They have the horses this year. You know, they didn't have the horses last year, and you did a great job naming a lot of those players that are going to make a difference. I will say this. There's one player, and let me rephrase. If Perkins, and this really is, you know, doesn't matter, but if Perkins does start, he came in as a very highly decorated true freshman from Mississippi, down in Raleigh, Mississippi. So the Gatorade Player of the Year, Mississippi Player of the Year. So I stand corrected. It would be 10 of the 11. But you get my point. A lot of transfers, and you named a bunch of them. I think a lot of people are looking for, you talked about Xavier Harris, but Chris Hardy, the redshirt senior transfer, is going to play defensive end along with Jared Ivey. He's going to be able to spell them. They're three group deep across that defensive front. You've already named a bunch. Kilo Stone is someone. TJ Dottery, a senior linebacker that transferred from Clemson, had a huge game in the Peach Bowl, formerly TJ Dudley. So definitely a name to watch. Chris Graves, a senior transfer, also a name to watch for Ole Miss in that secondary. Yam Banks, another senior transfer that is definitely going to be able to add some depth. I'll be interested too. Cam Franklin, will he play as a true freshman? He was a highly decorated 4-star out of Lake Commerce, Mississippi, one of the top players in the state of Mississippi. Also, Jeffrey Rush down on the coast, and William Eccles, a talented freshman. Will he get to play any this year? And I guess it's a good problem to have. Normally, Chris, if we're talking about Cam Franklin, William Eccles, Cameron Beavers, Jeffrey Rush, they're players that have to play immediately because Ole Miss doesn't have the depth across the defensive front. Not the case this year, and it's definitely a position to where I'll be interested to see. Kari Coleman's an interesting one. He had a really good year last year. He's a senior transfer, and then you named it Trey Amos. Trey Amos and Trey Washington. I've heard Trey Washington, by the way, has had an incredible fall camp so far. But Trey Amos is the transfer out of Alabama that's everybody's talking about. He's got a bit of a headhunter mentality, so he's definitely someone to watch. But Brandon Turnage, you threw that name in there, and I'm surprised you did because nobody's really talking about him. He's a bit of a journeyman, and for folks that don't know, he was a 4-star product out of Lafayette County High School in Oxford. Wanted to get away from Oxford, wanted to go off, went to Alabama, very good cornerback. Didn't work out at Alabama, transfers to Tennessee, and decides he wants to come home and play for the hometown Ole Miss Rebels. He's a senior. And, I heard, listen to my good friend Chuck Barrett over at Arkansas on ESPN Arkansas, and he basically made the comment that a lot of these journeymen, Chris, I think you'll understand, and a lot of the listeners and watchers will understand, some of these folks, this is their last rodeo. This is it. I mean, they can't transfer anymore. So they're going to want to do everything they can at this last stop to make a difference. You said it earlier, the last dance. And that's one thing that was coined for the Chicago Bulls back in the mid to late 1990s. And that's what Jaxson Dart's doing. Jordan Watkins, you named him a moment ago. We asked him what he wanted to tell the fans, and he immediately said, get your popcorn ready. We're going to score a lot of points. And he doesn't shy away from the fact that this team is going after one thing. They're going after a national championship, something that hasn't happened since the early 1960s. Ole Miss won 11 games last year, something that's never happened before. Lane Kiffin's number 2 behind Johnny Vaught in winning percentage. Been a lot of coaches come under the bridge since Johnny Vaught, and Lane Kiffin's number 1. So many different things. Lane Kiffin has absolutely broke the glass ceiling, but nothing would be bigger for Ole Miss than to host a college football playoff game. I've seen a lot of folks, we were tagged in the 24/7 piece that Brad Crawford did and had Ole Miss playing in the college football playoff as a 6th seed against Notre Dame. I can tell you this, Chris, if Ole Miss hosted Notre Dame in Oxford for a college football playoff game, I have no idea how much tickets would be, but it would be without question the biggest game in the history of Ole Miss football inside Vaught-Hemingway Stadium. That would be a fact.
So, Brad, quickly, let's talk special teams. I don't know how much Ole Miss is going to be kicking the football or punting it with how many points they're going to be scoring, but it's always noteworthy. Caden Davis is back at kicker. He was 18 of 23 on field goals a season ago. Hit a long of 56, by the way, so it was very, very good.
Which was that was a really big field goal on the road against Tulane. At the time, Tulane had cut it to one score, and Lane elected to kick this field goal in the fourth quarter. Ole Miss would eventually sack Tulane and return a fumble for a touchdown. But that game was close until Davis's field goal. But, yeah, that was a huge field goal by Davis.
Yeah, so he was really good. Fraser Mason is also back at punter. And then when it comes to the return game, I'd imagine, Brad, plenty of athletes to choose from in regards to who you want in that spot. So when it comes to Ole Miss special teams, Brad, obviously this facet of the game, it's not getting nearly as much attention or love, and we understand why, but it's still very important. This is still the SEC. You're going to be in some tight ball games. What is there to be excited about Rebel special teams this year?
Caden Davis is rock solid, Chris. He made the kicks when they mattered. I mean, he missed a couple, but there were big kicks last year. If you remember, there were some really close games. You got LSU, really close, could have went either way. You got Texas A&M, really close. Mississippi State was close down in Starkville until it opened up there at the end. So there were a number of games. I think there were 5 games. Tulane was close. And so Ole Miss did a good job at special teams. And Fraser Mason, it seems like he's been playing for Ole Miss for the last 15 years, but he's done great with his directional punting. And Lane Kiffin, we've talked about this, and I think you and I have shared some messages. It feels that Lane Kiffin is a little bit different since his dad passed away not long ago. And what I mean by that is I don't mean that he's any more somber. I just think that he's a little different. I don't know if it has changed his perspective, but even dating last year, he's grown considerably as a head coach. Being his 5th year, this is the longest he's ever been at a program as a head coach. So I think he's grown on the job, so to speak. And we've seen him punt more. We've seen him kick field goals more. Maybe a lot of that is because of personnel, but I think some of it is because just learning on the job. And I think this is going to be a game or a season full of games in which you're going to go on the road against South Carolina. You're probably going to have more talent, but that's a really raucous place to play. We don't know where Shane Beamer's team will be at that time. We don't know what their record will be, but we know the history of Williams-Brice in night games. Not to mention, Ole Miss has got to go on the road and face Arkansas. They've got to go on the road and face Florida. There's some trap games in there. You've got Oklahoma at home. We haven't even talked about LSU on the road. So there are definitely some games that special teams, I think, are going to play a key role in this season for Ole Miss.
And on that note, Brad, Ole Miss, 14 starters are back, 8 on offense, 6 on defense. Again, starters returning isn't as valuable a stat as it once was because so many guys that are going to make an impact for Ole Miss this year are brand new via the portal. But you mentioned, Brad, the schedule. I want to take a look. Let's look at the 2024 slate. You take on Furman, Middle Tennessee, at Wake Forest, Georgia Southern. Brad, you going to be able to stay awake during that 4-game stretch to start the year? No, then you dive into SEC play. You got Kentucky. You mentioned the road trip to South Carolina. At LSU is going to be a big one. Revenge game for the Tigers. Night game at Death Valley. Then you got Oklahoma at Arkansas, Georgia at Florida, and Mississippi State. Brad, when you look at the 2024 slate, what jumps out to you? And again, I can't help but mention, it's a schedule that it's as manageable, I feel like, as any for a college football playoff contender. Let's call it for what it is. It's been one that maybe's been criticized at times because of the Week 9 conference. I mean, when you look at this schedule, again, from the Ole Miss perspective, Brad, your thoughts, but I mean, this couldn't have worked out much better for Ole Miss than that slate that you drew this year.
Yeah, the Wake Forest game, of course, as you know, you have to schedule so far in advance. So at that point, Wake Forest had a pretty good team. And I do think Dave Clawson, who we all know, did a pretty good job at Tennessee as offensive coordinator. They lost a lot last year, but they've got some veterans coming back. But Ole Miss should be a couple touchdown favorite in Winston-Salem. So that's a game in which I think it works out good for Ole Miss. You go on the road, you face a formidable foe in the ACC to kind of work out some cobwebs of going on the road. Sure, the first couple of games are at home. They're very manageable. It gives you a chance to gel as a group, specifically with all these transfers. and then the season kind of opens up a little bit. Chris, I think the key to the season is LSU. I think the game at South Carolina is very, very similar to the game last year for Ole Miss on the road against Tulane, meaning a lot of people were talking about Tulane could be trouble. You better watch Tulane. Tulane could sneak up and beat Ole Miss. That's true. Tulane played well. At the end of the day, Ole Miss had to win that game. If they were going to have any type of season with any significance at all, they have to win that game. I can say the same for South Carolina. I get Shane Beamer. I get he's got a pretty good team coming back. A lot of focus is going to be on that Ole Miss-South Carolina game. Carolina's got LSU. They've got Kentucky prior to that Ole Miss game. Are they going to come in with 2 losses in the conference? We don't know. Can they get 1 win there and then come into that game with a little bit of a puncher's chance to make a little noise in the SEC? Ole Miss has to win that game, Chris. If they win that game, the season rides on LSU. And what I mean by that is if Ole Miss can be undefeated, go down to LSU, beat LSU, then it doesn't matter what happens to Georgia. You're sliding for the playoffs at that point. I think the Rebels could do good enough down the stretch to finish 10-2, 11-1, and make the college football playoff. Lose the game against LSU, the margin of error shrinkens quite a bit. Now, we could go into the numbers about Ole Miss and LSU at night. No, they're not great for Ole Miss. But I say all the time, it's all about talent. Who's got the most talent? I think right now Ole Miss has better talent than LSU, and I understand that's going to get thrown in my face and it's going to get stomped on and everything else. On paper, I think Ole Miss has a better roster than LSU. But the intangibles of LSU at night, they absolutely play a factor. If the Rebels can go to Baton Rouge and beat LSU, they have a front row seat to the college football playoff with Georgia on deck. Then you have to start asking yourselves, Chris, what happens with the SEC championship game? Does Ole Miss make it? If Ole Miss makes the championship game at 11-1 with a loss to Georgia, loses to insert team here, do they make it at 11-2? How many teams from the SEC get in? So Ole Miss actually could do better off not making the SEC championship game, making the college football playoff, and they could win the national championship with never playing in the SEC championship game. So a lot of stuff and a lot of things to talk about prior to December, and it's going to be an interesting run for sure.
Brad, you mentioned the transfer portal pieces in the early season, using that as time to mesh. I thought it's really interesting what Lane Kiffin said over the course of this offseason in regards to, we're a really good roster. We don't know if we're a great team yet. You're as close to this program, Brad, as anybody. What have you seen to this point, and what do you want to see early on from the standpoint of this team meshing, the transfer portal pieces meshing? Because it feels like you said, the talent's there. I mean, it's undisputable. The only thing that could maybe trip up Ole Miss is, trying to put a square peg in a round hole, just some of these pieces not working together. And I think that maybe even is a reach. But have you seen anything that gives you confidence and should give Ole Miss fans confidence that this thing is seamless? The new guys they're Ole Miss Rebels. This isn't a bunch of, we're hearing this phrase, Brad, it's a team full of mercenaries. If they run into adversity, these guys aren't invested in Ole Miss. They're just it's kind of like Florida State last year, respectfully. What can you say to that those situations are not the same, that everybody's bought in on the same goal?
That's fair for people that don't follow the program to think it's a team full of mercenaries. I get it, but I don't agree. And the reason I don't is because I asked the leaders on the team. I asked Jared Ivey, I asked Jordan Watkins, and I asked Jaxson Dart, and I'll share that conversation with you. I asked Jaxson Dart about, is it difficult when you have so many talented receivers? Because we've already talked about him. He knows everything about Jordan Watkins. He knows about Trey Harris, who transferred in from La Tech. But he doesn't know a ton about Deion Smith, that's transferring in from Holmes Community College and transferred from LSU. He doesn't know a ton about Juice Wells. But you know what? He's been throwing with all these guys during the summer. And I asked him, I said, how is it with players you had last year and then all of these new players, is it going to be an issue gelling together? And he smiled. He says, I've done it my whole career. And I encourage Ole Miss fans, if they get worried about how the team doesn't play together, look at what happened in Atlanta a couple of months ago whenever Ole Miss faced the number one defense in the country and had 475 yards midway through the third quarter. And, oh, by the way, that's the most Penn State had given up all year, and they were midway through the third quarter. And they were doing it with players that are coming back this year, with Jaxson Dart, Trey Harris, Jordan Watkins, Ulysses Bentley, and Caden Prescorn. Now they've added to that arsenal. So, no, I don't think this is a team full of mercenaries. This could be a team of destiny. And what I mean by that is it's a team that was put together to win a national championship. And once again, I don't believe Lane Kiffin, Jaxson Dart, and I don't believe players like Jordan Watkins are shying away from it. I think they're running towards it. They know what they have to do, and I think they're going right towards the freight train. They're not going to avoid it. They're going to try to win a national championship.
So, Brad, you mentioned that, and that's the goal, right? I think what's been interesting, it's like with each portal edition, it was kind of like Thanos gathering the Infinity Stones, because at one point it was like, okay, if Ole Miss can make the 12-team playoff, what an achievement. Then they added a couple more guys. It's like, well, they probably need to win a game to call this season a success. Now, all of a sudden, Brad, we're a couple weeks away from kick. It's not national championship or bust. Let's get that out of here. But it's not just good enough to make the playoff this year. This is a team, like you mentioned, with the pieces they've assembled. And I want to get your take on, I guess, realistic expectations, because you still want to, try to put a realistic spin on this thing. But is it winning 2 playoff games? Is it getting to the semifinal? Is it getting to the national title game? I mean, what are the expectations with Ole Miss faithful? I mean, how far can you see this team? Can they see this team going?
Well, it's a very layered answer. And it depends on who you ask in the fan base. Are you asking the older guy that watched the 1959 LSU Ole Miss game with Billy Cannon's run, in which Ole Miss would eventually beat LSU 21-0 and be crowned a national champion? Are you asking the fan that grew up in the 1970s during the Sloan years, to where it was a really, really tough sledding? Or is it the 80s with Billy Brewer? Is it the 90s with Tommy Tuberville? Is it the 2000s with David Cutcliffe and Eli Manning? Or the Ed Ogeron fan? Or the Houston Nutt fan? It all comes down to the fact of, right now, Ole Miss has a collection of talent it's never had. And so, depending on who you ask, I think a collection will tell you 10-2, play in the college football playoff, and the rest is gravy. I think that would be the answer you're going to get from most fans. Now, some of your fans that are younger, that have seen Lane Kiffin do great things, they have seen Hugh Freeze do great things, beating Alabama twice, they may tell you, need to win a game in the college football playoff with this roster. And you've got some fans that are, look, 10-2, playoffs or not, it's yet another year, a huge year, 11-1, make the playoff. A lot of them, Chris, want to make the SEC championship game, because Ole Miss has never done that before. So I think at the end of the day, you poll the average fan, 10-2, get in the college football playoff, and just push the pedal down and see where it takes you. And I think that's where most Ole Miss fans are sitting right now.
Brad, expectations are higher than they've ever been in Oxford. Final thing, and I'll get you out of here. Brad Logan of Inside the Rebels, again, one of the best in the business, someone I'm grateful to call a friend. It's hard to find holes, Brad, on this roster. It's hard to find holes on this football team. If you're being hypercritical and you're dissecting this team and you're saying they need to button up this, or this has to click, or this needs to work, what's the thing for Ole Miss they've got to make sure is buttoned up and it's got to click for the Rebels to reach their highest potential this year?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's very simple for me. It's tackling. It's button up their linebacker play, tackle better. I think they'll be fine across the defensive front. I think if there's a cause for concern, it's tackling in the secondary. We saw what LSU did with Jaden Daniels, and I get it. They had all their wide receivers, but Max Johnson lit up this secondary pretty good. Tulane did a good job against this Ole Miss secondary. So I understand there's some new faces in that secondary. I get that, but there's some familiar faces as well. They've got to defend the pass better, and they've got to tackle better. And we'll see that as the season progresses. But I think if I'm being critical, or one thing Ole Miss needs to do, it must tackle better. Mainly, Chris, tackling in space. I think that's something they definitely can improve upon.
Brad Logan of Inside the Rebels, and again, he's doing much more than that. Believe in Ole Miss podcast host. He's the Red and Blue Crew podcast. He's a co-host there as well. Many of the things. Brad, let folks know where they can find all your work.
Over on, of course, Twitter and X, where you and I hang out a lot. I'm at Brad Logan COTE. We encourage you to follow our Red and Blue Crew podcast. That's at Red and Blue Crew. That's David Johnson and I have a podcast. It's a lot of recruiting, Chris. I know Ole Miss fans love that recruiting, both transfer portal and high school. So we encourage keeping everybody up to date on that. And then I have a podcast with the Believe Network. That's where I get a lot of guests around the Southeastern Conference. And so I'm looking forward to previewing all of the teams coming up as the year gets on there. Excited to have you on too. So we'll definitely chat about the season. So that's, of course, a part of the Believe Network. It is the Believe in Ole Miss podcast. So excited about that. And I'm excited about a new venture I have with Max South Sports. That's, of course, Max South Cable here in Mississippi and all across the South. I have a podcast / it's more like yours. It's more of a video podcast with Max South Cable, and we talk about Ole Miss sports. Had Keith Carter on our latest episode, and we're excited to see where that brings us as well. So just ready for kickoff, and I know you are too, and excited to be on with you.
Brad, congratulations to you on all your success. Appreciate you taking the time, and we'll definitely do it again soon.
Thanks, Chris.